So I will have two questions for you. Right now, at this moment, what is the thing that you regret in your life the most? The next question is going to be, what do you think at the end of your life, or let's say when you're 80, I don't know how long we'll live, when you're 80, what do you think when you're 80 you're going to regret the most? So what do you regret right now the most, and what do you think in the future you'll regret the most? So I'll give you like half a minute to think about this and maybe write some answers. I think it's especially interesting to reflect about these things now because the last 2 years have not been easy. So many challenges, so many things are changing in the world. So a lot of things to contemplate. So before the semester started, I spent a lot of time sitting and thinking, what is it that I want to do in the upcoming year? Given all that's happened in the last 2 years, what is it that I want to do? Do I want to change something? Do I regret something? Good. So we have quite a lot. Let's see if we can try and make sense of this. So we have all sorts of things about here. Perhaps a regret about coming to Hong Kong. Anytime I waited for somebody to choose for me, not working hard enough in high school. That's really interesting. We'll come back to this. Not enjoying studying enough, about happiness. Didn't treasure the relationship with friends. Not reaching out to people that I admire. Caring out about others' opinions. So regretting caring about others. Not majoring in cognitive science. Choosing the wrong program in university. Not being very productive during middle school. Not exercising when I was small. So I want you to take a look at this and try to adopt the scientist mindset and try to categorize things. So this is not a representative sample. This is just people speaking up, whatever comes to mind, whatever they think somebody else in the classroom is going to look at and maybe judge them, or whatever they think is suitable for sharing. Could be all sorts of things. But both based on your own experience of thinking of your regret. And some of the things that you see here, what kind of themes come up? What do people regret right now in this moment? What do you see? Yes, please. Not. Yes. Things of inaction. I did not do something and I regret. I wish I would have taken action in order to do something. Like what? What did you see here? Yeah, not studying enough. Right. Not taking another action. What other regrets can you think of things that you haven't done? What's good examples for inaction regrets? Not doing something like what? Not saying something. Yes, not speaking up when you had something to say. Yeah. So already you identified two categories. One is inaction, things that I didn't do, I wish I would have done. And the other one is regret of action, right? I wish that I didn't do something. And you can try and categorize these things and see what are the differences in those. Anything else that you notice? What else do you see over there? How would you categorize these kinds of regrets? Yes. Yeah. Okay, good. So we have these categories of relationships with others, something that happened in an interaction with another person, or some things that have to do with your own goals, with your own journey. That's great. What do you think is stronger here? What's your sense, or in your own contemplation of your own regret? Is it about yourself more, about relationships? So it sounds like there's a little bit of a disillusionment where you thought you knew yourself, but then you took a decision that maybe didn't work out as you expected, and then you're disappointed with yourself. So you're saying the impact of that might be perhaps stronger than some of the impact with somebody else. But that's something interesting to think about. Is that your experience? Is this is how you feel about things when you compare what it is that you do compared to relationship? Which one do you regret more? Good, thank you for that. Any other categories or things that you think about in terms of regret? Okay, good. So making the differentiation of things that you can actually still do So your ability to change those if you regretted those. For example, you regret not majoring in cognitive science, perhaps you can now take up cognitive science or something. You can do something about it. This is your ability to change something into the future. And there are things that you can't change anymore. Perhaps they're fixed. Perhaps, I don't know, you had an accident or something horrible happened. Or perhaps there's something that you cannot overcome, cannot change. So that's a good dichotomy. Anything else before we move on to the second question? Wait, let me see if I saw anything else here. Oh, we have quite a lot. Okay, didn't pursue my passion in music and art. Not starting university a year early. Academic failure in 2008. Wow, that's a long time ago. Yeah, I think also what's interesting about regrets, and I've done a lot of research about regret, and I know a lot of people who do research about regret, is that typically you would think that when you ask people about their regret, they will say, don't want to think about this. I would rather not answer this. This is, a sensitive area. But actually, what I find is the people really very open about their regrets, even very personal and private things. So when we elicit regret, sometimes we do, these surveys where people can just answer in 2 words and keep on going. But then sometimes we get these essays, but entire stories that people really felt like they want to, share with us. They want to take the burden off and give to us. So sometimes there's something very freeing in taking a thought that was stuck in your mind about something that you regret, and then just putting this, even like punching something and putting this anonymously on a Mentimeter. I feel that it's a very freeing kind of process. So giving freedom to your regret sometimes helps you reach a conclusion about what to do about this regret, feel better about the regret, not living healthy enough. Nearly everything is decided by parents in high school. Yeah, starting to smoke, failed to seek out help about my friends, emotional issue in secondary school. Yeah, these are great. Thank you for sharing these. So the second task is I want you to think down the road. I know it's difficult to think about this. Some of it is like 60 years ahead. For me, it's a little bit shorter than that. When you're 80, contemplating back on your life, what would you regret the most? And try and think about this in the dichotomies that we talked about. So we had the dichotomy of action in action. We had the dichotomy of self versus relationship. We had the dichotomies of things that I could have done but haven't done, or could and couldn't. Try and think about it in these kinds of dichotomies and then try to frame this rather clearly about towards the end of the life, what are the things you think that you will regret the most? It doesn't have to be something concrete because you don't know what your life is going to be. It's more about the theme. Action, inaction. It's going to be more about self, more about relationships, more broadly society. Not seeking independence from the parents, having wasted a lot of time, yeah. Not enjoying life enough, caring too much and not being confident enough, always taking too little risks, too much pressure on yourself, not spending enough time with people I'm close with. These are very good. What can we learn from this kind of question? What can we learn looking at people's projected regret? Why is this powerful? What can we do with this? Yeah, in what way? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. So thinking about anticipated regret, the things that we might regret in the future, shows us a little bit about the things that we care about, the things that we value, the things that we want, but perhaps are scared that we can't get. And then it allows us to form some kind of goals and trying to think, how can I change? If this is changeable, if it's in my ability to change this in the future, perhaps, my parents, my high school, up until now, last 2 difficult years, very difficult, very challenging. I'm regretful. But sometimes it really helps to try and think, in the future, in 60 years, looking back at my life, what is it that I will regret the most? And then act on it. Do something about it. For me, I strongly recommend this. I don't know how old your parents or grandparents are, but my father and my mother retired not too long ago. And for them, the age of retirement is something that gets you to contemplate a lot this kind of question, not hypothetically, but really in the moment. And asking them what it is that they care about, what it is that they regret, what is it that they value, what would they have done differently if they had the chance. So when you go home, when you see your parents, when you meet your grandparents, it's a good question to ask. It's a good conversation starter. If you're worried about them not wanting to share this, I think you'll be very surprised that actually they have a lot to say. And it's very similar to some of the themes that are here. So it's about value. What have I contributed? What is my legacy? What kind of things do I want to leave behind? What kind of things have I done in my life in order to build up to that? Some of it is things like happiness. Have I been happy enough? Sometimes it's about how much happiness have I been to other people. So thinking about your own regrets, contemplating about regrets together with other people that you care about, especially if they're at this kind of stage, can really help you define your values, see what's important for you, and then try to think how you can change your life, how you can adopt the path that you've taken in order to make things better. You're in a position right now where you're starting your life. I know it doesn't feel like this because you're in ongoing challenges. We're going to talk a lot about happiness in judgment decision making. So for you to make the right decisions, you do need to take into consideration what it is that's important for you. Your well-being, your happiness, the well-being of others around you, their happiness, and so forth. Back to regret, Daniel Pink. I don't know if you heard about this guy, but he is very, very prolific. He writes a lot of amazing books. And to my great surprise, his most recent project was called The Power of Regret. And just like we contemplated how thinking about regrets can drive our future action, the title is How Looking Backwards Moves Us Forward. So I think it's really interesting for him to do this project because if I would do research on regret, and I do research on regret, and I tell people, please share your regrets with me, people say, pay us. Give me some money to participate in your research, give me credit for participant pool, or, I can get 100 here, 100 there, maybe 1,000 if I have a research budget. But when Daniel Pink posts, please share your regrets, he gets tens of thousands of stories, people just sending this to him because he's very, very well known. So it's amazing that it started from this little project. He didn't know how big this is going to be, but now he's sitting on this data set, this remarkable data set of so many amazing stories, which if you go and read the book or if you listen to him in podcast or watch him on TED or YouTube, then he shares some of these remarkable stories about regret. And just like what we did over here, he adopted the scientist mindset. He also spoke to a lot of researchers that I know, trying to understand, to categorize the different types of regret. And he came to some interesting insights that I don't think we had in the literature. So sometimes some of the best evidence or some of the best work, at least in categorizing, thinking about something, comes not necessarily from researchers or academics or professors. Sometimes it comes from some prominent people who write a book. So he identifies 4 types of regret. Foundation regrets, if only I've done X, mainly for myself. If I have done this for myself, then things would be better. Boldness regrets, if only I'd taken the chance to do something. I wish I would have taken the chance. Moral regret, if only I'd done this, done the right thing. Or connection regrets would have to do something with an interaction that we have with other people, especially about not reaching out, not overcoming some of the difficulties, the challenges that you experience with other people. So I'll let him share a little bit. It's going to be like 5 minutes for him to say a little bit of his insights about this in his TED Talk, which was online during the pandemic in an interview.
Let's talk about regret. It is, to my mind, our most misunderstood emotion. And so I decided to spend a couple of years studying it. And one of the things that I did is I went back and I looked at about 50 years of social science on regret. And here's what it tells you. I'll save you the trouble of reading a half century of social science. The research tells us that everybody has regrets. Regrets make us human. Truly, the only people without regrets are 5-year-olds, people with brain damage, and sociopaths. The rest of us, we have regrets. And if we treat our regrets right, and that's a big if, but there are ways to do it, regrets can actually make us better. They can improve our decision-making skills, improve our negotiation skills, make us better strategists, make us better problem solvers, enhance our sense of meaning if we treat them right. And the good news is that there's a systematic way to do that. But I want to take just a few minutes to tell you about another aspect of regret that I think is really, really just super interesting. As part of the research here, I decided to ask people for their regrets. And to my surprise, I ended up collecting about 16,000 regrets from people in 105 countries. It's an extraordinary trove. And what I realized when I went through this incredible database of human longing and aspiration is that around the world, and there's very little national difference here, people kept expressing the same 4 regrets. Around the world, there are the same 4 regrets that keep coming up over and over and over again. So what I want to do is just quickly tell you about these 4 core regrets, because I think they reveal something incredibly important and interesting. So the 4 core regrets that I'm uncovered. Number 1, what I call foundation regrets. Foundation regrets. These are people who regret things like this: not saving enough money, which would be like, financial regret; not taking care of their health and not eating right, health regret. But they're the same. Those kinds of regrets are about making choices that didn't allow you to have some stability, a stable platform for their life. I have a lot of people who regret not working hard enough in school. A lot of people who regret, I got a lot of regrets about not saving money. And it's the kind of thing, it reminds me a little bit of Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper, where earlier in their life, they acted like a grasshopper instead of the ant, and now it's catching up with them. So foundation regrets sound like this: if only, and that's the catchphrase of regret, if only I'd done the work. Second category, I love this category, it's fascinating. Boldness regrets. Boldness regrets. I have hundreds of regrets around the world that go like this. X years ago, there was a man/woman whom I really liked. I wanted to ask him or her out on a date, but I was too scared to do it, and I've regretted it ever since. I also have hundreds of regrets by people who said, I've always wanted to start a business, but I never had the guts to do that. People who said, I wish I'd spoken up more. I wish I'd said something and asserted myself. These are what, as I said before, what I call boldness regrets. And we get to a juncture in our life and we have a choice. We can play it safe or we can take the chance. And what I found is overwhelmingly, people regret not taking the chance. Even people who took the chance and it didn't work out don't really have many regrets about that. It's the people who didn't take the chance. So this is boldness regrets. Boldness regrets sound like this: if only I'd taken the chance. Third category, moral regrets. Very interesting category. These are people who, again, a lot of these regrets begin at a juncture. You're at a juncture. You can do the right thing or you can do the wrong thing. People do the wrong thing and they regret it. I mean, one of the most amazing, one of the ones that I just really stuck with me, I'm going to try to pull it up here, is this one here. This woman, she's a 71-year-old woman in New Jersey. When I was a kid, my mother would send me to a small local store for a few items. I frequently would steal a candy bar when the grocer wasn't looking. That's bothered me for about 60 years. So 71-year-old woman in New Jersey. For 60 years, she's been bugged by this moral breach. And so moral regrets, we have people regretting bullying, we have people regretting marital infidelity, all kinds of things. Moral regrets sound like this: if only I'd done the right thing. And finally, our fourth category are what I call connection regrets. Connection regrets are like this. You have a relationship or ought to have a relationship. And it doesn't matter what the relationship is. Kids, parents, siblings, cousins, friends, colleagues, but you have a relationship or ought to have had a relationship, and the relationship comes apart. And what's interesting is that what these 16,000 people were telling me is that the way these relationships come apart is often not very dramatic, not very dramatic at all. They often come apart by drifting apart rather than through some kind of explosive rift. And what happens is that people don't want to reach out because they say, it's going to be awkward to reach out and the other side's not going to care. One of the lessons that I learned from this book for myself is always reach out. So that's what connection regrets are. If only I'd reached out. And so over and over and over again, we see these same regrets. Foundation regrets, if only I'd done the work. Boldness regrets, if only I'd taken the chance. Moral regrets, if only I'd done the right thing. And connection regrets, if only I'd reached out.
But I really like this summary. First, I like this summary because it's quite amazing if you look back at the Mentimeter, that almost every one of these categories appeared in a very small sample here of 21, 26 for both of the questions that I asked you. So you're still not 80, but you contemplated very similar things of what you might regret to what actually people said in a real interview regarding their regret, what they shared about their life. So many of the things that you said about, not doing well in school, or about not speaking up, or about all sorts of things, not taking a chance, or not doing all sorts of things, is stuff that keeps coming up here. But for me personally, I just want to share with you, the last 2 years, I've had a lot of time to sit with myself stuck in a room. I've done 6 quarantines, coming in and out of Hong Kong, in various places in the world, sometimes even in like Penny Bay, stuck with all sorts of. So I've had a lot of time with myself to think, what is it that I regret? What is it that I would want to do differently for the future? And I think almost every one of these had an impact on me. And I think it was also interesting for me to contemplate which one of these is the most important for me. Did I take the chances that I could have taken? Did I make a change when I saw a chance to do something that's different? I think especially moral regret is something that bothered me a lot. So I don't know how you feel about this person. You're still early stage in your careers. But for me, seeing the pandemic, what's happening in the world, thinking, I'm a researcher at one of the top universities in Asia. What can I contribute to helping alleviate the pain that people are experiencing during this pandemic? We're asking other psychologists, what can we do to contribute to this? And most of the time, it's like, we don't know. Because we sit in our rooms with our laptops and fluorescent light and we write papers. But there's a very big disconnect between what it is that we do research on, what actually happens in real life. So one of my regrets immediately was very easy to identify, that I regret I would do something that's a bit more practical. I regret that my research doesn't have real life implications. I am very happy that I did open science and I tried different things with HKU students, but I really wish that we could have taken some of that in order to help some of the challenges like addressing the pandemic. And for me, it also kind of became a moral issue. What does it mean that I'm not doing something meaningful with my life where I can help other people? And once you think about this, when you expand the boundaries of your own self and look at the world, and I think in the pandemic, really, we've expanded beyond ourselves because we understand that we're one big global community. What is my moral responsibility, not just to the people here at HKU or Hong Kong or my family, Israel, where I grew up? What's my responsibility to the entire world? It's not just pandemic that is happening, but also climate change, global warming. What am I doing about this? Is my research relevant? Is what I'm doing in dedicating my life? I don't want in 30 years to think I could have done something, but I decided not to do it. I could have done something, but it was just very comfortable to be a professor sitting in a room and punching the keyboard. So I'm hoping, and part of the changes in this course, in this semester, is me trying to shift a little bit from just doing, hands-on science, statistics methods to trying and make this a little bit more applied. I know that I can't do this overnight. I know that I can't shift everything that I do. I also have the structure around me. I have some constraints, but I am starting to think how I can take chances in order to make some differences, so I can live up to the possibility of not experiencing moral regret. I think connection is especially important during the pandemic, especially when you sit with yourself alone in a room during quarantine, that you realize how important people are in your life. So I don't know how many of you have ever lived in a different country than your home, that you've got up and left where you grew up in order to experience a different culture and disconnect from everything and have to build a new social circle. But the meaning of when you're in trouble, when you're facing challenges, who do you reach out to? Who do you regret not keeping in touch with? If you lost somebody during the pandemic, is like, do you regret not being part of their life, not staying in touch? So I've had a lot of these kinds of regrets. I had a lot of time to think about, I need to reach out. I need to maintain my connections. I need to think beyond my specific life choices about coming to a different place and building a new life, regarding what is important to me, the people who are important to me in my life. So you can think about these 4 different categories and see how this relates to you. And if you want to know more about what other people have done, I think a lot of interesting books came out during the pandemic because people had some time to sit down and read those. But this project has been going on way before the pandemic. So some very interesting insights in there. So, for example, you can just flip through the book and see, some very interesting charts. For example, the most common regret, at least from this paper in 2011, is about romance, family, education, career. And it does seem like people occasionally reflect on this, sometimes quite frequently, and I think during a pandemic more often than not. But all the things that they could have done differently, or the things that they would like to do in their lives, if we only get another chance to live life as normal. So life in Hong Kong is still not normal. The world is pretty much open. I've never imagined this. Like a year ago, if you would tell me the world is open, I would just like, it's impossible. This pandemic is never going to go away, and it might come back, but we're giving an unbelievable opportunity. So before we forget that there was ever a pandemic, to just sit and think what we experienced during this pandemic and how it's going to change the way that we do things in the future. This takes me to one of the classic research in judgment and decision making. So this is the first time I'm talking to you about actual research. In judgment and decision making, or what has become titled behavioral economics, started with 2 psychologists, and their names are Kahneman and Tversky. Tversky unfortunately passed away in the 1990s, but Kahneman is very much alive. He's in his 80s, I think. He's in Princeton and he's very, very active. He just came out with a book also during the pandemic. People come out with books called Noise, which is a very hard read. I think it's even at the bookstore over here. So very prominent people. And if Tversky would be alive, him and Kahneman would win together. So because Tversky passed away, only Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics. So Kahneman is the only living psychologist who has won the Nobel Prize as a psychologist. The reason why we don't have more psychologists winning the Nobel Prize is because there's no Nobel Prize for psychology. There's only Nobel Prize. The closest that we can get is economics. And it's very rare, to the point of almost being impossible, for psychologists to win the Nobel Prize in economics, because economists don't like psychology. They look down at us. There's a very little interaction. But Kahneman was the first that bridged it. So these 2 scholars, talking about cognitive biases, heuristics and biases in psychology, understood that psychologists, doing their own research on the side is not going to help the world unless we involve ourselves with economists and bridge the gap between the model for human rationality offered by the economists with all that we know about mankind, people in psychology. So Kahneman and Tversky, very prominent folks They are the beginning of behavioral economics. Now, one of the nice things, and I think this really contributed to them winning the Nobel Prize, is sometimes you hear about psychology research that is very complicated. Very complex models, moderation, mediation, multi-level, with all sorts of things going in different directions. Kahneman and Tversky had amazingly simple thought experiments. So they gave scenarios, which they wrote in their papers, asking people simple questions. And I'll give you one of these questions. This is some of the work that later led to prospect theory and what they received the Nobel Prize for. So this is George and Paul, and they are investors. They've invested $1 million US. And now we have this dichotomy that was raised before in one of the differences that you might have regarding regret. There's action and inaction. So one of them decided to switch, George, and one of them decided not to switch. So they're facing a decision. So they've already invested $1 million US, but then they have the decision, do they want to switch to a different company or remain? And now there's a contrast between them because one of them decided to switch and one of them decided not to switch. So George switched, Paul didn't switch, and the outcome was the same for both of them. Even though one decided this and the other decided that, the outcome was negative. Both of them lost about 20%, so 200,000 US dollars. The question is, who feels a higher regret, stronger regret? So I'm going to shift this here, and you get a chance to share with me what it is that you think. So when we look at these two, Paul didn't switch the investment and George switched the investment, and then they both found out that they have 20% loss at the end. Yes, please. Whether they have a comparison? Let's say that they do. Maybe you can tell me why you think this is important. This is actually an interesting question. So here you think they will compare whether their loss is bigger than the other, and then in regards to that, experience regret. Okay, good. Yeah, very good. So already you're doing, let's say, an extension to the research, adding a moderator. A moderator is, did they have the conclusion, the results of the other person to compare to or not? So reference point. How am I doing compared to what the other person is doing? So it's a good question, but in the basic scenario that they presented with people, there wasn't any reference to that. But in some of the extensions that we did to this work, we actually used quite a bit of reference points that I'll share with you. Before I show you the results, what do you think is going to what's going to be the result here? Which one is going to be regretted more, action or inaction? Sorry? Inaction is going to be regretted more. Why? This is interesting. Is there something unique about this scenario that differentiates this from the questions that I asked you before and what Daniel Pink did? What's the difference between this scenario and the two questions that I posed for you before? Yeah, first of all, there's a previous action, right? There was a previous decision, so some reference point to the previous decision has been made. Good. Any other changes that you've seen in the scenario? Think about this. Good, thank you. Any other predictions about what the results are going to be? What are the results going to be, at least for us? Yes, please. 50-50. So what's interesting here is that I didn't give you the possibility of staying in the middle. I forced you to choose one or the other, right? So sometimes in research, when we want to get people to make a decision about this, we only give them two options without saying in between. But if people don't really care, they're going to choose randomly, and then it's going to be like half and half. So if it's half and half, we say people don't really care. It's the same, action and inaction. So it is possible here. I was trying to create the contrast so people will have to make a decision. We'll see. Okay, so we say inaction about the same. Any other prediction? George, action, taking action will regret more. Why? Okay, so the effort, the energy, and energy and effort leads to what? Yeah, so there's a stronger connection, a causal connection between I did something and that caused the loss, something like that, right? Maybe a stronger sense of responsibility for the action that was taken. Because if you didn't take an action, you just sat behind and something happened. So passive and active, that sort of thing. So think about this. Already you saw the different things, and I have to admit that I biased you a little because I already showed you David Pink and I showed you what the reactions were to the other two. But if we look at the results here, so George is higher than Paul, not by much. So let's say if we run a statistical test on this to compare this to 50-50, I don't think this will come out significant. We're a small sample, but you can see that this is higher than this, even though I biased you in the previous one. So there is something about action George, effort, about investment, responsibility, that gets people to think that perhaps George would be more regretful, even though we said, David Pink said, and what we saw is that it seems like when we ask questions about what you regret in your life, or what do you think you will regret when you're 80, it does seem to be more about not taking action. So perhaps there's something very interesting going on over here, because this is more in the moment, and this is actually very close to what, very much in the direction of what Kahneman and Tversky were saying. Actually, for them, and I've replicated this many times, was 92 and 8, so stronger than the 15 and 11. So very strong bias towards George and the taking action, right? And the question is, what is happening here? So why is this happening? Why do we tend to regret these sorts of things? Why? And then there's the question of what is normal. So one of the great theories that came out from Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, and one of his students, Dale Miller, who is also still very active in Stanford, is that they came up with norm theory about what is normal. And unfortunately, when we see things go negative, when things are happening, when there's a risk involved, and we don't know whether this is going to play out or not, people tend to prefer inaction. When somebody, because they're very scared that if they take action, and this will result in a negative outcome, that they will regret it. Because when we look at these sort of things with the decision makers, with investors, in romantic relationships, it does seem that at least in the moment, if things happen badly, there's a pandemic, something turned out to be, badly about a decision that you've made about cognitive sciences or about whether to, take a trip or not, ask somebody for a date or not. In the moment, you feel regretful about taking action, which leads many of us to prefer not taking action. Let's just go with the status quo. Let's just go with everybody else is doing, because the norm around us is to not take action. So there's a lot about inaction being the normal in this norm theory by Kahneman and Miller in 1986. To me, one of the first projects that I did in my postdoc was to ask, but how do we know what is normal? So one of the papers that came out of this is ask the question, but what is normal? How do we define what is normal? And we define what's normal based on reference points. What do we refer to? Maybe it's a comparison to the other person. Maybe it's a comparison to our decision in the past. Maybe it's a comparison to what the norm is around us. So what is normal? What defines what a normal behavior is over here? So this is one of the papers that came out. And what's interesting over here is that the only thing that I did is to ask the same kind of question of who is it going to be, George or Paul? Is it action or inaction that's regretted more? And all the time, so I've replicated this many, many times, the higher regret was for taking action. But it was especially so when the norm around you was for not taking action. So you can see over here an inaction norm. When there's an inaction norm, it's above 80%. When let's say in a society that emphasizes more taking action, and there are some places in the world where action seems to be more of the norm, even then it's a little bit closer, but still more for action. But I also had an experimental condition that not only said manipulated action norms or inaction norms, but I also had a neutral condition when I didn't say what the norms were, so that I can compare how people perceive the norms right now. So I wanted to see the control condition, is it going to be closer to action or inaction? And what this shows is that we're much closer to the inaction norm, which suggests that the way that we think about these scenarios is that the norm in our society is not to take action. There's something very strong about these norms, and we're talking about social norms over here. So our social norms is that when there are risky situations, when there's the possibility of us losing, we tend to not take action because we don't want the effort, the responsibility, the causal link between us doing something and then this and then ending up being differently. First year that I did judgment decision making, there was a student. His name is Kit. He's now a PhD student at Chinese University of Hong Kong. He took that course with me. Then he decided to come and do a thesis with me the year later. And then he became the teaching assistant for this course. And then he became an MPhil student. So he studied with me for 2 years. And now he is doing his PhD. And he was very intrigued by this action in action. And he was especially intrigued with these differences between why in this investment scenario, it seems like regret for action is stronger. But when we ask people about their lives, more things come out regarding them not taking action. So he decided to do a replication. So we did a replication together of a very prominent paper, and I'm going to introduce the person who did this. His name is Tom Gilad, who decided to look at Kahneman and Tversky, this 1982 paradigm, and try to see if there's a difference between the way that we frame it about in the moment, the short-term regret, and the long-term regret, the more nostalgic long-term regret. And he had this scenario. So this is 1994, study 3 and 4, and actually he did these slides pretty good in his thesis defense. So let's say, for example, both of them studied in the East Coast universities, and the decision, one of them decided to stay in that university, and one of them decided not to stay in this university and switch to a different university. And the outcome is that both of them are unsatisfied. And then we had 2 different kinds of questions to ask them. One was the short term, who feels stronger regret in the short term, and who feels stronger regret in the long term. And then we wanted to see what kind of an impact this has. He also added an extension. So many of the projects are replicating what the classics did and then adding something in addition to that. So because you raised the issue of causality, effort, and responsibility, he added some of these to the classic article, and we added this as an extension, also looking at responsibility. And what you can see over here is this is the paper that came out of this. It was just published like a few months ago, so that's a great achievement for Kit. And what is nice over here is that we were able to find support for the original findings using different designs in 3 of the studies. So there were 4 studies, and in 3 of the 4, we found support for their hypothesis. What is the hypothesis? People perceive or experience stronger regret over action compared to inaction in the short term, yet stronger regret over inaction in the long term. So something flips, something switches. So it could be now that we have a chance to do something, but the norms around us are for not taking action. The norms are for inaction. But it's very possible that down the road, when we're older, when we reflect back on our life, we'll realize that we've made a major mistake. I think many people are not aware of this kind of flip in their regret. So many times people live their lives according to the social norms, missing out on a lot of opportunities, not taking action because the norms, the pressures around us, the fear of loss, the fear of regret is driving what it is that we do. But if we take the long-term perspective, if we ask ourselves, not how do we feel now, because now we're full of emotions, now we're full of regret. We ask ourselves, in 60 years, when we're 80, how are we going to feel about this? We'll realize that actually our perspective changes. So next week, we're going to talk about how in judgment and decision making, sometimes what we need to do is ask ourselves, reframe a question, ask ourselves something from a different perspective in order to decide what kind of action or decision we want to take in our life. Sometimes we ask ourselves, what does the other person think? how does the other person look at me? Because I'm so involved in what it is that I'm doing right now. But how does the other person see me when, I'm playing poker, when there's other people engaged, when both of us are decision makers? So this is my decision. This is how I feel. But how does he feel? How are my feelings related to him? So putting yourself in a different perspective, asking yourself a different question in time frame can help you gain a deeper understanding of the decision at hand, and maybe can de-bias you, maybe can reduce some of the strong tendency to regret the action. So you're looking ahead. So right now we're talking about just in terms of our regret, our feelings, our outcome of how good we feel with ourselves. This is the only thing we're talking about right now. But to address the bigger issue of how do we know, we will try and come out with some strategies on how to optimize this kind of decision so that we know that we're getting as close as possible to the answer of did we make this right or wrong. But this is a very good question. This is just dealing with us, how we see ourselves, regardless of evidence. We are going to need to include evidence in that at some point, and this is coming up in the future. But at least for us, what we do know is how we're going to feel, and we can do something about the way that we feel, and we can address that. And many times, the way that we feel, our happiness, our well-being, the happiness of people around us, the well-being of people around us, is a very strong predictor of our ability to achieve certain things. If you feel bad about yourself, if you feel regretful, then you're not going to be able to execute anything. You're not being able to improve your life. So this is the classic article. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to jump into this. This is Thomas Gilovich. So I'm going to play a little bit from him. So you'll get to know him, and I think we'll conclude with that. Let me just see if there's something else. Yeah, so I think the point I was trying to make is that some people, their response to regret is, I would just have to ignore this. There's nothing that I can do about this. And then it's delusion. Some people say, feeling is just a feeling, and then it's like despair. I can't do anything about this. But sometimes, and this is what he's trying to drive to, regret is a very strong force for change. So let's hear from Gilovich, and we'll end the session with that.
One of the reasons I like studying judgment and decision making is that we all make judgments, decisions all the time. And so I can study decision making in relationships, political decision making, sports decision making, economic decision making. So the variety to the job is a lot of fun. Secondly, it's very rewarding to studying judgment and decision making because I think they can help us think straight about all of the pressing problems the world faces, whether it's climate change, growing income inequality, the possible disappearance of work as robotics and artificial intelligence gets more developed. More and more people are put out of work. That's a different world, and we need to make very strong decisions about that too. That should be a good thing. We'll be richer than we've ever been, and we shouldn't screw that up. And so far, the signs aren't great that we're not going to screw that up. So, anyway, I think the study of judgment and decision making has a lot to offer for all the world problems, because most of the world's problems are human problems. Yeah, regret's interesting in a whole bunch of ways. One is you could imagine a world in which it would be hard to study, because if you ask people, "Oh, tell me about your biggest regrets," people say, I don't want to do that. Turns out not to be the case. I'm sure there are some regrets that people hide from us, but people, especially over time, really want to talk about them, and they find some value in talking about them. So we learn a lot. And among the interesting things is when you make a mistake, it's often a mistake of action that hurts the most. So imagine that you're in a grocery store line and it's just the person in front of you has 1 million coupons and they're just taking forever, and you see the line next to you, people are zipping through it. You face a decision, should I switch to that line or not? Imagine you do switch, and that line slows down, the line you were in speeds up. You're going to really kick yourself that, it's a mistake of commission. You moved, you took action. You feel much worse about that than a mistake of inaction at first, in the short term. Over time, however, turns out to be completely the opposite. People's most common regrets, long-term regrets over their life, are things they didn't do. I never went to college. I never learned to play a musical instrument. I should have pursued this person who expressed an interest in me at a certain period of life.
I think it's really important to also listen to the people who actually found this phenomena and studied this for a very long time. And he's a very prominent scholar. So if you go to his Google Scholar page, you'll see that he has a lot of citations and publications. He's very, very well known. And I can also say from personal experience that we are able to replicate his work. So for me, I wanted to start with this. This is not the typical starting for judgment and decision making, because I don't want to regret what I'm doing in this course. I want us to try and do something that's different, which is why I'm kind of shifting the direction. And hopefully by next week, I'll be able to present to you the syllabus and what it is that we're going to do. But I do want us to be relevant for pandemics, for global warming, climate change, for poverty, for helping others, for us to have a real impact using the research that we do in order to use judgment decision making to have an impact to make the world a little bit better. So that sums up our introduction. Hopefully that will give you a little bit of a teaser of what I mean by judgment decision making research and the kind of activities that we do. Hopefully it will get more and more engaging, more and more games, more and more activities. If you have any questions, things that you want to talk about, you're always welcome to email me and write to me about what you're worried about. This is my email. You can also go on my website and see all the other courses. And hopefully see you next week. Thank you.